Okay, in this last segment, I'll say a few words about the reading from Griswold, which is the third reading of this week, and then a few comments about Marxist thinking about culture and society, and that'll be it. Griswold is a terrific example of a modern-day sociologist. She's writing this article, I think in the 1980s, late 1980s. Terrific example of how we could try and use some of his ideas. Not to say that all of culture, all of the superstructure is just one big ideological force that covers up the nature of reality, but to at least look at how the nature of social and economic conditions do influence culture. In this case, influence novels. So Griswold drops right into the reading, and she's writing saying that there, over the course of 100 years, has been a lot of argument about what is the American novel? What's the quintessential American novel? And she decides to come at this question as a sociologist, because she basically says, look, if you just pick, say, Red Badge of Courage or Moby Dick as the quintessential because they're super popular, you'll end up with one conclusion about what the American novel is. But what you really need to do is to compare American novels to European novels to see, is there a difference between these two types of novels, and if so, what is the American novel? And in the process of doing so, she's actually looking at two different Marxist arguments, which I'll follow through here really quick. She shows, first off, that social and economic conditions do influence a cultural product like the novel. So the novel arises in the 19th century as mass education developed, so a social change, think base, as a middle class developed, in other words, a class that was able to not be just doing, as Marx called, wage slavery in the factories, but actually be able to accrue some capital and have kind of sustained ongoing incomes that allowed them to have leisure. So another thing going on in the base. And as the domestic sphere, the household run by the lady, was differentiated from the economic sphere. Again, another example of what's happening in capitalism in the 19th century. You have the development of these spheres where genders are pushed, and specifically women in middle class are pushed as quote-unquote their sphere. So she says, Marx seems to be onto something, that these social and economic conditions can affect the superstructure, using the novel as an example of the superstructure. She also finds that some of the plots seem to really fit with this particular class. So this cultural product that does reflect the economic conditions of the bourgeoisie middle class. For example, these novels are mostly they mostly have nothing about work in them, despite the fact that most people work. Okay, so they're being read by middle-class women who really don't work. They do work all the time, of course, but they don't work out in the factory outside the home. And there's nothing in the novels about the difficulties of marriage. There are all these kind of wonderful stories about rising and income and finding love and having a good loving relationship at the end of the novel, but nothing about the actual day-to-day business of marriage, if you will. So they have kind of an escapist tendency. So again, more evidence how social and economic conditions can produce certain cultural forms, in this case, the genre of the novel. Now, what she does, looks at next, is says, to answer this question about is there a quintessential American novel, she said you need to do two comparisons. One, you need to compare 4 time periods, and you need to make this comparison with both US and European novels. So she takes a sampling of novels from 4 different time periods. Let me zoom in on this for a second. She takes a US sample of US novels from this time period, European novels. US novels from this period, European novels. And she goes down the list. And then they do this really cool content analysis where she has graduate students, read the novels and pick out the themes that are being read in the novels. And she finds this really interesting pattern, which is that there are some differences between novels between US and European novels in this period. And there's some differences, so I can draw an arrow like this, that means difference. And there's some differences between novels in this period and a later period. And she's asking the interesting question of why? What's going on here? And what she points to is that right here, so maybe I should use another color. Right here, after this point, all of a sudden the novels become really similar. And in this later period, they become, in these later periods, they become similar in the periods. And, this is important, they become similar between Europe and the United States. They all have the same dang plots. So Griswold asks, what's going on? And her argument is, well, this kind of helps, in a Marxist framework, this makes sense because right at this moment, copyright law changed. Up until this point in the United States, to reprint a book, you had to pay copyright fees to the author whose book you were reprinting. However, if you were a smart publisher in the United States and wanted to make a lot of money, you could actually print a European book and you didn't have to pay that European author copyright money. So what this caused was American writers were somewhat constrained. American writers and publishers, and there was a close linkage between the two, were somewhat constrained, and so they had to write novels that were different than European authors. So they had to make a distinction. So their novels were a little bit different, as Griswold shows in her argument. However, boom, copyright law changes, and after that time period, because now both authors in both Europe and the United States have to be paid copyright fees, there's no difference really in the financial outcomes of those two groups. And so there's no longer any difference for American themes, for the novel in America to be that much different. And so all of a sudden you see the themes converge together and be no difference. So her answer to her question is, there really is no such thing as the American novel. However, there are differences between periods and between countries, and the differences end when the economic conditions change. So it's a Marxist argument in the sense of that she's taking economic conditions seriously, economic law, and noting how when things shift, when there's dynamism, when there's change, the actual product, so the superstructure that reflects those economic conditions, can change. Pretty brilliant argument if you ask me. So let me give you some wrap-up thoughts here on Marx and culture. Maybe I can give you a couple of problems with the Marxist view of culture. One problem is that it can be hard to do. So Marxist analysis, it can be really hard to go beyond just kind of broad examples. Even the broad examples I gave you on like the India caste system and Hindu ideas about that legitimate that caste system. That's a really interesting broad example, but it can be very difficult as we start to get to more details about actual kind of, in the words of Williams, actual forms of consciousness, so ways of thinking, or actual cultural practices, or actual institutions. But to do it, so it is hard to do, but to do it, we've got to make specific arguments like that. We have to use some of Williams' ideas about what to look at. And then like Griswold or like Pope, we have to look at those things really carefully and then see what the connections are between the economic reality and the form of culture that is produced. So it's hard to do. The Marxist vision can sometimes be too deterministic. And what that means is it can be too simple sometimes to make the claim that, oh yeah, every aspect of culture is just a reflection of economics and who has power. That can be true in really important ways, but it can also be not true. So, for example, how would a Marxist argument explain the fact that religion can be prophetic? So, for example, if you think of the civil rights movement was was born of American religious groups with these prophetic ideas about liberation and freedom. Well, Marx would have a real hard time making sense of that because those ideas were in conflict with the dominant forms of segregation and oppression and economic system that supported oppression and segregation. So a Marx argument can be too deterministic in terms of drawing that arrow from base to superstructure too straight, or thinking that it always exists perfectly, that there's a perfect relationship. In reality, the relationship between culture and economic base is a lot more dynamic and can shift over time and can be hard to trace. And then finally, does Marx really help us to understand what individuals think about culture, or what things mean to them? What does a novel mean to someone? What does it mean to someone who goes to church? What does it mean to somebody who's a lawyer and practices law in a superstructure system dedicated to the capitalist economic system? Marx doesn't really help us to understand that much at all, because Marx himself really kind of did no sociological work like that. He was mainly a theorist and then kind of a broad historical comparative sociologist, looking again kind of at broad tendencies and kind of the broad course of relations between economics and the cultural sphere. So I've said quite a bit in this lecture. Make sure you get some of the main ideas I put here, particularly things that I write on the whiteboard, and then the slides that I inserted into this video will also give you some sense of some of Marx's actual words, as well as some of those camera obscura diagrams to try to get what he's arguing, and that his project in the world was to help us realize that the way reality is talked about by the superstructure flips what reality actually is. And his whole goal was to get people to focus on the reality of the economic system and to free themselves from ideology that legitimates the unjustness of that economic system. Now, next week, we're going to talk about kind of a second era of Marxist thinking, where we talk about mass culture, something that didn't exist in Marx's day. These are things like, Hollywood, right near where I live. And we'll talk a little bit about some critical thinking about the way culture works in a mass culture setup like that. Okay, that's it for now. As always, send me your questions. Have a good week.